A king's severed head fell into a basket on January 30th, 1649. England had just executed its own ruler in the name of law, something that should have been impossible in a world where kings ruled by divine right. But this moment didn't begin in 1649. It began with a meadow, a document, and 40 armed men who did something even more impossible. What happened next, across 6 centuries of conquest, civil war, and catastrophe, would accidentally create the legal foundations of American democracy. One brutal battle that replaced an entire language. A charter signed under threat of death. A king who wanted a divorce and destroyed a 1,000-year-old church. A civil war that killed a nation's ruler. And a chain reaction nobody planned. But that changed the world forever. This is 1,000 years of medieval England, the kingdom that became America's blueprint for freedom. And it begins with 300 Viking ships sailing toward the most important betrayal in English history. The year was 1066. England was rich, peaceful and powerful under King Edward the Confessor. Then Edward died without children in January. 3 men claimed the throne. Harold Godwinson was England's most powerful lord. The day after Edward died, Harold was crowned king. But across the English Channel in France, William, Duke of Normandy, was furious. William said Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. He claimed Harold had sworn an oath to support this promise. Whether Harold actually made this oath didn't matter to William. He believed Harold was a liar and a thief. Harold's problems multiplied. His own brother Tostig had joined forces with Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway. They wanted the throne too. In September, the Norwegians invaded northern England with 300 ships. They crushed the English defenders at a place called Fulford near the city of York. Harold was in southern England, waiting for William's invasion. When news arrived about the Norwegian attack, Harold made a stunning decision. He marched his entire army north, nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. The exhausted English soldiers arrived at a bridge called Stamford on September 25th. The battle was savage. All day long, English and Norwegian warriors hacked at each other with axes and swords. By sunset, both Harald Hardrada and Tostig lay dead. The Norwegian army was destroyed. Only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors home, out of 300 that had come. Harold had won a brilliant victory. His men were celebrating. Then a messenger arrived with terrible news. William had landed. 2 days after Stamford Bridge, on September 27th, William's invasion fleet reached the southern coast. William brought between 4,000 and 7,000 men, archers, crossbowmen, foot soldiers, and mounted knights on horseback. The English rarely used cavalry. William's combined force was unlike anything Harold had faced before. William immediately built a wooden fort at Hastings and did something calculated to enrage Harold. He ordered his men to burn farms and kill livestock. He was destroying English villages on purpose. William wanted Harold to come fight him before the English king could rest his battered army and gather reinforcements. It worked. Harold took the bait. The exhausted English army marched south. Harold gathered what troops he could along the way. On the morning of October 14th, Harold positioned about 7,000 men on a ridge 7 miles from Hastings. Many were half-armed peasant farmers. Many were wounded from Stamford Bridge. They formed a shield wall, overlapping shields creating a defensive barrier. At dawn, the battle began. William's mounted knights charged. The English shield wall held. Norman arrows rained down. The shield wall held. For hours, the Normans attacked. For hours, the English stood firm. Neither side could break the other. Then William tried something desperate. He ordered his cavalry to pretend to retreat. Groups of English soldiers, thinking they had won, broke ranks and chased the fleeing Normans. Suddenly, the Normans wheeled around and cut down the scattered English troops. As afternoon faded to evening, the battle hung in balance. Then Harold died. Some say an arrow struck him in the eye. Others say Norman knights hacked him down in brutal close combat. Either way, with their king dead, the English army scattered into the gathering darkness. William had won. On Christmas Day, 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. What happened next changed England forever. William didn't just become the new king. He replaced almost every English lord with Norman lords from France. The English language disappeared from government and was replaced by French and Latin. For 200 years, if you wanted to speak to anyone important in England, you spoke French, not English. The Normans built massive stone castles across the country, powerful fortresses that showed everyone who was in charge now. They built huge cathedrals with soaring arches. They created a rigid system where everyone served someone above them, all the way up to the king. In 1086, William ordered a complete survey of his new kingdom. Every piece of land, every farm, every village, who owned it, what it was worth. This enormous record was called the Domesday Book, meaning the Book of Final Judgment, like the biblical Day of Doom. Nothing escaped William's attention. The Norman Conquest wasn't just a new ruler, it was a total transformation. French-speaking foreigners now controlled England, but their children would become English, and the legal systems they built would eventually cross the ocean to shape America. But first would come rebellion, civil war, and a meadow by a river where history would turn. By 1215, England stood on the edge of disaster. King John was the worst king England had ever seen. He lost wars. He raised taxes to crushing levels. He threw people in prison without trial. He stole money from the rich and the poor alike. Even the Pope was angry with him. For 6 years, churches across England were closed by papal order because of John's stubbornness. The final straw came in 1214. John tried to win back English lands in France. The campaign was a complete catastrophe. The furious barons had paid enormous amounts to fund this disaster. When John's army was destroyed at a battle called Bouvines, the barons snapped. In early 1215, rebel barons seized London. John's position collapsed. Civil war loomed. To save his throne, John had to negotiate. On June 10, 1215, John met the rebel leaders at Runnymede, a flat meadow on the bank of the River Thames. The location was carefully chosen. It lay exactly halfway between John's fortress at Windsor Castle and the rebel stronghold at Staines. Neither side held the advantage. The rebels presented their demands. For 10 days, intense negotiations continued. Archbishop Stephen Langton mediated between the furious king and the determined barons. On June 15th, they reached an agreement. On June 19th, the final document received the royal seal. They called it Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta had 63 sections. Many dealt with medieval problems that seem strange today, things about fish traps in rivers and payments owed to lords. But buried in the ancient language were ideas that would shake the world. One section said the king couldn't tax people without permission from his barons. Another said no free man could be arrested or punished except by legal judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Another promised that justice would never be sold, denied, or delayed. But the most revolutionary idea was simple. Even the king had to obey the law. For hundreds of years, European kings believed they ruled by divine right, chosen by God to rule however they wanted, answerable only to God himself. Magna Carta said no. The king must follow the law like everyone else. This single idea would echo through the centuries. But here's the truth. Magna Carta wasn't written to help ordinary people. It protected rich barons, church officials, and wealthy merchants. These people were maybe 25% of England's population. The other 75%, peasants and poor farmers, got nothing from Magna Carta. They had no voice and no rights under this charter. And King John never intended to keep his promises anyway. Even as he sealed the document, John was secretly writing to the Pope, asking him to cancel the agreement. John said the barons had forced him to sign against his will. He started hiring soldiers. The barons, not trusting John for a second, kept control of London and kept their armies ready. In September 1215, the Pope answered John's letter. He condemned Magna Carta and declared it completely invalid. By autumn, England was at war. John's forces attacked rebel castles. Villages burned. The barons invited the French king's son to invade and take the throne. England descended into chaos. Then, in October 1216, John suddenly died. Some say from illness, some say from poison. Nobody knows for certain. John's 9-year-old son became King Henry III. With a child on the throne, everything changed. The government around the young king wanted peace. They reissued Magna Carta in 1216 with some changes. They reissued it again in 1217, and once more in 1225. Slowly, over decades, Magna Carta became part of English law. For the next 400 years, it was acknowledged but not particularly important. Then came the 1600s, and lawyers rediscovered it. In the early 1600s, England's kings believed they were chosen by God to rule absolutely. King James III said kings were like little gods on earth. His son Charles then believed the same thing. But a brilliant lawyer named Edward Coke was reading old medieval documents. Coke had been Attorney General under Queen Elizabeth I and Chief Justice under King James I. Now he was studying Magna Carta, and he emerged with a radical new interpretation. Coke argued that Magna Carta represented ancient English freedoms that went back before even William the Conqueror. No king could violate these freedoms. As Coke famously declared to Parliament in 1628, Magna Carta will have no sovereign. Was Coke's interpretation historically accurate? Not really. He was reading a document about medieval barons' rights and claiming it meant universal individual freedom. He was projecting 1600s political ideas onto a 1200s document. But his ideas were powerful, and they came at exactly the right moment. Charles I became king in 1625. He desperately needed money. He tried to force people to pay taxes without asking Parliament. He threw people in prison without trial. He put soldiers in people's homes against their will. Parliament fought back. In 1628, led by Coke and others, they presented Charles with the Petition of Right. The petition directly invoked Magna Carta. It demanded that Charles respect traditional English liberties. No taxes without consent, no imprisonment without legal process, no soldiers in homes during peacetime. Charles reluctantly agreed. Then he completely ignored his promise. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled alone for 11 years. This period is called the Personal Rule. Some call it the 11 Years' Tyranny. But when Charles tried to force his religious policies on Scotland, in 1637, the Scots rebelled. To fight the Scottish War, Charles needed money. To get money, he needed Parliament. In 1640, Charles was forced to summon Parliament. It became known as the Long Parliament because it would sit for years. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Parliament demanded limits on royal power. Charles refused. Both sides raised armies. In August 1642, civil war began. The English Civil War split the nation. Royalists, nicknamed Cavaliers, fought for King Charles III. Parliamentarians, nicknamed Roundheads, fought for the power of Parliament. Oliver Cromwell entered the war as a nobody. He was a member of Parliament and a cavalry captain. He was over 40 with zero military experience. But Cromwell had something special: an instinctive genius for warfare and unshakable determination. Cromwell recruited his cavalry based on talent and religious passion, not noble birth. He wrote in 1643, "I would rather have a plain captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than a gentleman who is nothing else." His cavalry became legendary, disciplined, motivated, unstoppable. They won battle after battle. In 1645, Parliament created the new Model Army, a professional force commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, with Cromwell leading the cavalry. This army was revolutionary. Soldiers were promoted based on ability, not family connections. They were paid regularly. They trained to fight as coordinated units. On June 14, 1645, the new Model Army faced the King's forces at Naseby. The result was devastating. Cromwell's cavalry shattered the Royalist army. The King's cause never recovered. Charles therefore surrendered in May 1646, but victory brought new problems. What should happen to the king? Should he be restored with limited powers? Should monarchy be abolished? For 2 years, negotiations went nowhere. In 1648, royalists launched a second civil war. Cromwell crushed it swiftly and brutally. The army had lost all patience with Charles. In December 1648, soldiers purged Parliament of members who opposed trying the king for treason. What remained was called the Rump Parliament. In January 1649, the Rump Parliament created a special court to try Charles I for high treason. The charge was making war against his own people. No English king had ever been put on trial before. Charles refused to recognize the court. He argued that a king chosen by God could not be judged by men. But on January 27, 1649, he was found guilty. The court declared Charles Stuart was a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer. The sentence was death. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles III walked from St. James's Palace to the banqueting house in Whitehall. A wooden platform had been built outside a second-floor window. Thousands of people filled the streets below. Charles wore 2 shirts that morning. He didn't want to shiver in the cold and have people think he was afraid. He gave a short speech. He said he was innocent. He said he believed kings ruled by God's appointment. Then he knelt and placed his head on the execution block. The executioner's axe fell. A single stroke. A groan rose from the crowd. Some people rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood, believing it had healing power. England had killed its king. This sent shockwaves across Europe. It proved that no ruler was above the law, not even kings chosen by God. England became a commonwealth, a republic without a king. But the new government struggled. Cromwell faced rebellions in Ireland and Scotland. He crushed them with brutal efficiency. His campaign in Ireland in 1649 included horrific massacres at 2 towns called Drogheda and Wexford. That would be remembered with bitterness for centuries. In 1650, he defeated Scottish forces at Dunbar. When Charles I's son, known as Charles II, invaded England with a Scottish army in 1651, Cromwell destroyed them at Worcester. Charles II barely escaped and fled to France. By 1653, Cromwell had dissolved even the Rump Parliament in frustration. He was named Lord Protector, essentially a dictator, though he insisted he ruled legally. He tried to work with new parliaments, but dissolved them when they wouldn't obey. England became a military dictatorship. Cromwell died in September 1658. His son Richard tried to succeed him, but was hopelessly incompetent. The whole Commonwealth collapsed. In 1660, the army invited Charles II back from France. The monarchy was restored. The Commonwealth had failed. But something fundamental had changed. Parliament had executed a king, ruled without monarchy for 11 years, brought monarchy back on Parliament's terms. Never again would an English king claim absolute power. And in 1661, vengeful royalists dug up Oliver Cromwell's rotting corpse. They hanged it at Tyburn. They cut off his head and stuck it on a pole outside Westminster Hall. It stayed there for 25 years. The message was clear. England's transformation had come at a terrible price. Before the Civil War, England had already experienced its most shocking transformation. In 1509, Henry VIII became king at 17. For 20 years, he was a devoted Catholic. He even wrote a book defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther's Protestant movement. The Pope gave Henry the title Defender of the Faith. English monarchs still carry this title today. But Henry had a problem. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter named Mary, but no son. In the 1500s, Henry believed that without a male heir, England would collapse into civil war after his death. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God because she had previously been married to his older brother Arthur, who had died young. Henry wanted the Pope to cancel his marriage so he could marry Anne Boleyn, a beautiful lady at court who had captured his attention. Normally, the Pope might have agreed. Such political favors weren't uncommon. But 1527 was a terrible year. Imperial troops had just attacked and destroyed Rome itself. Pope Clement VII was basically a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's beloved nephew. The Pope couldn't cancel the Emperor's aunt's marriage without causing a diplomatic catastrophe. The Pope stalled. He dragged out negotiations for years, while Henry grew desperate. By 1532, Anne Boleyn was pregnant. If Henry was going to avoid being married to 2 women at once and ensure his child was legitimate, he needed to act fast. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, had a radical solution: break with Rome entirely. In 1533, Henry secretly married Anne while still married to Catherine. Thomas Cranmer, whom Henry had maneuvered into becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's first marriage invalid. The Pope excommunicated Henry, kicked him out of the Catholic Church. England's response was the Act of Supremacy of 1534. This law declared that Henry VIII was, and always had been, supreme head of the Church of England. Papal authority in England was completely abolished. The ancient idea that church and state were separate, with God's law above human law, was eliminated. The English church became, essentially, a department of the government. Breaking with Rome gave Henry control over the church's massive wealth. Between 1536 and 1540, Henry shut down over 800 monasteries and religious houses across England. Their lands, buildings, and treasures were confiscated. Historians call it the greatest seizure of property in England since the Norman Conquest in 1066. The crown's income exploded. Much of the stolen land was sold to nobles and wealthy men, creating a new class of landowners who would never allow England to return to Catholicism. They'd lose everything. Not everyone accepted this quietly. In 1536, uprisings in northern England, called the Pilgrimage of Grace, nearly toppled Henry's government. Rebels united to defend the monasteries and the old religion, but the uprising fell apart from internal divisions. Henry crushed the rebels brutally. Their leaders were executed. Henry's religious changes were contradictory. He had broken with Rome, but remained Catholic in his personal beliefs. He wanted control of the church, but not necessarily Protestant theology. This confusion would cause decades of religious chaos. When Henry died in 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward VI became king. The government that ruled for Edward was dominated by passionate Protestants who pushed England rapidly toward Protestant beliefs. Churches were stripped of their statues, stained glass, and religious art. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, but Edward died young in 1553. His successor was Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, a devout Catholic determined to restore England to Rome. Mary reversed the Protestant reforms. She restored Catholic worship. She married King Philip II of Spain. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary by burning nearly 300 Protestant heretics at the stake. But Mary died childless in 1558 after only 5 years. The crown passed to Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, a Protestant by upbringing and necessity. Elizabeth restored the Protestant settlement, but with practical moderation. She declared herself supreme governor rather than supreme head of the church, a subtle change meant to calm Catholics. She established a middle way that would define Anglican Christianity for centuries. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. Under her, Protestant England became permanent. And across the Atlantic Ocean, English colonists were carrying their Protestant faith and their English legal traditions to the shores of North America, planting the seeds of a new nation. In 1606, King James I granted a charter to the Virginia Company to establish a settlement in North America. The charter was written by Edward Coke, the same lawyer who championed Magna Carta against royal power. It included a crucial promise: colonists and their descendants would have all the liberties, franchises, and immunities as if they had been born in England. This wasn't just nice words. It meant English colonists in America brought the entire system of English common law, English political traditions, and English rights, including those in Magna Carta. Every colonial charter made similar promises. Massachusetts Bay promised colonists would have and enjoy all liberties and immunities of free and natural subjects. Maryland, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, all guaranteed colonists kept their English rights. In the 1600s, as colonies spread along the Atlantic coast, colonists created their own legal codes. Many explicitly included principles from Magna Carta. In 1641, Nathaniel Ward compiled the Body of Liberties for Massachusetts, a legal code containing direct references to Magna Carta's protections: freedom from unlawful imprisonment, protection against unlawful seizure of property, trial by jury, and fair legal process. In 1687, William Penn published The Excellent Privilege of Liberty and Property in Pennsylvania, the first printing of Magna Carta on American soil. Penn's commentary reflected Edward Coke's interpretation. Magna Carta was fundamental law protecting individual freedom. Few colonists could afford legal training in England, but they knew English law remarkably well. During a parliamentary debate in the late 1700s, Edmund Burke observed, "In no country in the world is law so widely studied as in the American colonies." Young colonists like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison studied Edward Coke's legal writings intensely. They absorbed his interpretation of Magna Carta and English constitutional history. By the 1760s, colonists had developed a strong identity. They believed they were creating a society that took the best of the English system and improved it. A place where people rose by talent instead of birth, where men could speak their minds and participate in government. Then came the crisis. The 7 Years' War left Britain deeply in debt. Parliament believed the colonies should pay for their own defense and began levying direct taxes. In 1765, the Stamp Act required that virtually every document, newspapers, licenses, legal papers, even playing cards, carry a stamp showing taxes had been paid. The colonists exploded in protest. They had no representatives in Parliament. No taxation without representation became their battle cry, and they traced this principle directly to Section 12 of Magna Carta, which had forbidden the king from levying taxes without the consent of his barons. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 petitioned King George III, declaring their rights were confirmed by the Great Charter of English Liberty. The conflict escalated. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. Colonists organized resistance. Both sides armed. In April 1775, British troops and colonial militia exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. In July 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Its language echoed Magna Carta's principles: complaints against a cruel ruler, a list of rights violated, an assertion of fundamental freedoms. Thomas Jefferson and the other founders weren't wild revolutionaries trying to overturn tradition. They saw themselves as conservatives preserving their constitutional rights as Englishmen, rights they believed Parliament and the Crown had betrayed. John Adams wrote they were fighting for the preservation of the English Constitution, not for the overthrow of it. The colonists won independence through 8 years of brutal war. When they gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write a constitution for their new nation, they drew heavily on English precedents. The Constitution established limited government, separation of powers, and checks and balances, all principles with roots in English constitutional development. But the Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, most clearly reflected Magna Carta's legacy. The Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process: no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, echoed Section 39 of Magna Carta almost word for word. The Sixth Amendment's right to trial by jury descended from English common law tradition. The Eighth Amendment's ban on excessive bail and cruel punishments traced directly to Section 20 of Magna Carta. Historians have calculated that about 40% of the rights in the US Bill of Rights can be traced to Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights. An even larger percentage, nearly 70%, came from colonial legal traditions that themselves descended from English common law. The founders knew exactly what they were creating. As one scholar noted, they were attempting to create a Magna Carta for a new era. Standing in 2026, we can see an extraordinary journey across 1,000 years. It began with violence, The Norman Conquest of 1066 replaced an entire ruling class. William the Conqueror imposed foreign language and culture on England through ruthless military force and bureaucratic control. Nothing about the Norman Conquest suggested democracy or freedom. Yet the feudal system the Normans introduced created the conditions for Magna Carta. The feudal system implied reciprocal duties. Lords owed protection to vassals, vassals owed service to lords. Even kings owed obligations to their subjects. When King John violated these customs, the barons had a framework for demanding their rights. Magna Carta itself wasn't democratic. It protected maybe 1/4 of England's population. Barons, church officials, wealthy merchants. The vast majority of English people gained nothing from it. But Magna Carta established a principle that proved revolutionary. The king was subject to law. That principle lay mostly dormant for 4 centuries. Then, 17th century lawyers like Edward Coke rediscovered and reinterpreted it, transforming a narrow baronial charter into a declaration of universal rights. Coke's interpretation was historically questionable, but politically powerful. It gave Parliament intellectual ammunition against royal absolutism. The English Civil War was catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. A king was executed. A military dictatorship was established. The Commonwealth failed. Monarchy was restored. On the surface, nothing changed. But everything changed. Parliament had demonstrated it could overthrow a king, rule without monarchy, and restore monarchy on its own terms. Royal absolutism was dead in England. The Reformation was driven by Henry VIII's desire for a son and his impatience with papal authority. It wasn't initially about religious freedom. Henry wanted control, not tolerance. Yet breaking with Rome shattered medieval religious unity in England. Once the door to religious change opened, it couldn't be closed. Protestant and Catholic factions fought for control. But gradually, painfully, England developed a degree of religious tolerance. Each crisis built upon the last. The legal traditions that developed through centuries of English history, common law, parliamentary government, protection from unlawful arrest, trial by jury, fair legal process, weren't planned by wise visionaries. They emerged from messy political struggles, compromises, defeats, and unintended consequences. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic, they brought these traditions with them. They believed these rights were their birthright as Englishmen. When Parliament and the Crown threatened these rights, the colonists rebelled. Not to create something entirely new, but to preserve what they believed was already theirs. The supreme irony is that England itself never fully embraced the democratic implications of its own constitutional traditions. Britain remained a monarchy. Until the 19th and 20th centuries, only a tiny fraction of British subjects could vote. The American revolutionaries took English principles of limited government, rule of law, and individual rights, and pushed them to their logical democratic conclusions in ways that England itself did not. Medieval England, through conquests, conflicts, civil wars, and constitutional evolution, became the unlikely birthplace of modern democracy. The kingdom that killed a king. That fought brother against brother. That burned monasteries and executed heretics. That imposed brutal feudal hierarchies. This kingdom somehow forged the legal and political foundations that would inspire the American experiment in self-government. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, delegates faced a fundamental question. How could they create a strong central government while protecting individual liberty? They turned to English constitutional tradition for answers. They created separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, designed to prevent any single person from wielding absolute power. They made the legislature bicameral, echoing Parliament with its House of Commons and House of Lords. They limited executive power and made the president subject to law, enshrining the principle Magna Carta first declared, "No one stands above the law." The Bill of Rights listed rights that English legal tradition had developed over centuries. Freedom of speech and press, the right to petition government, protection against unreasonable searches, trial by jury, due process, protection against forced self-incrimination, protection against excessive bail and cruel punishment. These weren't abstract philosophical principles invented by Enlightenment thinkers. They were concrete legal protections evolved through centuries of English common law and constitutional struggle. The American Constitution became a model for democratic movements worldwide, but its roots were unmistakably English, forged through 1,000 years of conflict on a small island in the North Atlantic. From the Battle of Hastings to the Declaration of Independence, 710 years passed. In that time, England transformed beyond recognition. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom, conquered by William, became a Norman French-speaking realm, which evolved into an England that spoke English again. But English transformed by centuries of French and Latin influence. The absolute monarchy of William the Conqueror became a limited constitutional monarchy where Parliament held ultimate power. The Catholic kingdom became a Protestant nation that exported its religious conflicts and diversity to America. The feudal hierarchy became a society where common law gradually extended protections to wider circles of people, though full equality would take centuries more. England fought civil wars that killed tens of thousands, executed a king, briefly abolished monarchy, restored it on new terms. England dissolved monasteries, burned heretics, persecuted Catholics and Protestants depending on which monarch ruled. England built a globe-spanning empire and lost its most valuable part when 13 colonies declared independence. Yet through all this turmoil, certain threads persisted. The idea that government should be limited by law, that rulers should be accountable, that individuals possessed rights that couldn't be arbitrarily taken away, that decisions affecting the community required consultation and consent. These ideas were contested at every stage, violated more often than honored. Progress wasn't linear. There were centuries of regression and stagnation. But the ideas survived, written in Magna Carta, invoked by 17th century lawyers, fought for in civil war, carried across the ocean by colonists, enshrined in the American Constitution and Bill of Rights. The story of how medieval England became the mother of American democracy isn't a story of inevitable progress or wise planning. It's a story of conflict, catastrophe, and unintended consequences. Of how principles forged for narrow interests of powerful barons became, through centuries of reinterpretation, the foundation of democratic government. In 1215, when 40 angry barons forced King John to seal Magna Carta at Runnymede, they had no vision of American independence or universal human rights. They wanted to protect their own privileges from an overreaching king. But they established a precedent that echoed through the ages. Power must be limited. Law stands above any individual. Rights once recognized can be claimed and defended. From the meadow at Runnymede to Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the thread runs clear. Medieval England, with all its brutality, inequalities, religious conflicts, and civil wars, forged the legal and constitutional framework that made American democracy possible. The kingdom became the blueprint for the republic. The charter demanded by barons became the inspiration for a constitution created by the people. Standing in the 21st century, we see the paradox complete. From conquest came freedom. From conflict came constitutional government. From 1,000 years of English history came the ideas that transformed the world. Ideas that would ultimately travel back across the Atlantic to reshape the land where they were born. This was medieval England. This was the kingdom that became America.